in a box, like what are we talking about? Are we talking about extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials or some sort of trans-dimensional entities, or is the mind more powerful than we realize? All of the above?
Yes. Well, what I would actually say is I think, like a lot of people, if you get into the subject like I do when you're a kid, everything's pretty much black and white, Bigfoot's a giant ape, the Loch Ness Monster's a dinosaur, UFOs are piloted by aliens from this star system or that star system. But I guess, like a lot of people, the more I've dug into it, I began, and certainly this probably happened more when I was sort of in my mid to late 20s. I began to sort of see more beyond just the nuts and bolts angle and realise, there were distinct crossovers between the world of ufology and a lot of paranormal activity. Issues that you would see in areas that a lot of ufologists today won't touch. I mean, for me, there are clear parallels between today's abduction experiences and centuries-old stories of, like, incubus and succubus type encounters. They both involve somebody, in bed late at night, in the early hours of the morning, asleep. Then they detect a presence in the room. There's always a sexual aspect to it. The person's unable to move, sort of paralyzed. And of course, you have differences, but if you look, the archetypal aspect of it is actually very similar. In the same way, you can find parallels between the so-called little people and the fairies in the 1600s. They would kidnap men and take them to the fairy kingdom because the fairy kingdom was blighted and they needed new stock. You can find countless stories like that in 500, 600-year-old European tales of fairies. Clearly, they kind of parallel today's abduction stories as well. And also, when you look at the issue of the phenomenon itself, I'm far less convinced today that we're dealing with just what we would call nuts and bolts aliens. I think the phenomenon itself acts in such a strange way that it goes far beyond that. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If it was just somebody else's equivalent of NASA coming here, but far more advanced, I think, it would be more black and white. But when you find, I know you may have experienced this, but the more I have dug into, certainly over the decades, the more I've dug into the UFO subject, the more I found myself having sort of very weird synchronicities, just some amazing ones at times. And I just don't see how just a nuts and bolts species from another planet can induce that. It almost suggests like a spiritual aspect to it. When I say spiritual, I don't necessarily mean, one particular religion or another, but something that sort of goes beyond the boundaries of just, like I said, somebody else's NASA. And I'm more inclined also to believe we're dealing with something that coexists with us. I would actually be surprised if it's just extraterrestrial nuts and bolts aliens. I'd be extremely surprised today if that was the answer. I think we could be dealing with something that, in some degree, has coexisted with us for as long as we've been around. I kind of take the view that people like Keel did, that we could be dealing with some sort of phenomenon that sort of manifests in different ways to the people of different cultures. Maybe 500 years ago, people did see sort of fairy-like or goblin-like creatures in the same way today that we see the Greys. Back in the 50s, people saw the Space Brothers, these long-haired aliens. Maybe somebody's incubus or succubus 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or Lilith, very similar to the incubus stories, was a literal, literally how they saw them. Perhaps a lot of it is down to the eye of the beholder. Perhaps the phenomenon itself can manifest in different ways according to our subconscious. But whatever it is, I think it's not going to land on the White House lawn, because that sort of that ties in with the preconceived belief that, well, there are aliens coming to visit here in metal ships. I think it goes much deeper. I think, for me at least, the one person who got closest to understanding and getting across to readers the sheer alien, not in extraterrestrial sense, but the sheer alien in terms of weirdness nature would be Whitley Strieber with Communion. When that book came out, it was a bestseller, and I think I know a lot of people in ufology at the time were thinking, wow, this is going to blow the whole abduction thing wide open onto mainstream, and to a degree it did. But what I liked about Strieber's book, he actually tied it all in with other issues, like these sort of fairy parallels, goblins, and linked it with the sort of realm of the afterlife, that suggesting that these entities could sort of inhabit our 3D world, but also be in like an ethereal world in the realm of the afterlife, that kind of thing. And it went into some really esoteric areas, and I think that's where the subject leads. For the answers aren't going to come, for the most part, I don't think, by searching the stars. Ironically, I think one way to sort of open the doors to the truth, no pun intended, is psychedelics, DMT, things like hallucinogenics. They're clearly being shown to, for me at least, open doors where people have experiences very similar to abduction experiences, particularly with DMT. They sense a presence, often these little figures flitting around. And I think in a lot of these cases there's good evidence that people aren't just tripping and hallucinating. They're actually seeing something that in the regular world we don't see. In the same way, you don't see X-rays, you don't see microwaves, but they're all around us, and I think it's something along those lines. We're dealing with something that's alien in the sense that it's so strange to us, but it's far beyond, sort of just a craft standing on tripod legs that you can go up and tap on the side.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment, and I'll talk more about that in the membership section based on my own experiences. But altered states of consciousness, in a manner not dissimilar from psychedelics or perhaps paranormal experiences, can also be attained through things like meditation, breathing exercises, ceremonial magic, initiatory rituals, and I could probably name a few others as well. But those don't seem to be quite as popular with people interested in ufology or psychedelics, as far as I'm aware, and I'm just wondering if you had any comment about that. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
Well, I think the thing with psychedelics and hallucinogenics is more, that's sort of an immediate thing. I know actually quite a bit about ritual magic and things like that, and a lot of those procedures take, a hell of a amount of time. Mm-hmm. Other situations will get you into an altered state extremely quickly. So I think a lot of it comes down to that, today's world's a fast world. People want something immediately, and I think that actually comes into play in this issue. But I think it all comes down to one thing, whether it's meditation, whether it's prayer, whether it's, altered states, whether it's meditation. It all comes down to one thing, and that is rendering yourself into some degree of an altered state of mind. And I think, I don't pretend to know how or why it happens, but I do think that when you open yourself up to something and you put the message out there, something picks up on it. As I say, I don't know how or why, but it does, and I found that in my work a lot over the years, that some people might think it's crazy, but sometimes I will put a thought out there or ask a question, is there a way I can get answers to this? And then very often I find such a weird synchronicity might happen in the next couple of days, which actually helps answer at least part of the question that I was looking into. So, I do think there's sort of an untapped world out there we don't understand, but which over the millennia, has been distorted and given sort of stereotypical imagery. For me, there's no doubt that the UFO phenomenon has its positive and negative sides, like a lot of these phenomena, and if you get caught up with the wrong things, it can cause a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of these entities, or whatever you want to call them, probably responsible for ancient accounts of like demons and jinn and stuff like that. You know, one person's demon is another person's jinn, you know, and things like the shadow people, black-eyed children, all these kind of things where you're clearly dealing with something that is interconnected with all this, but has been given different titles and names and descriptions because people interpret it, you know, from their own particular culture. And so I think it is one of these areas where you need to tread carefully. And I think John Keel made a good point about this, or made most of the good points about this, as to how you can get sucked into these subjects and it can mess with people's lives. And that's one of the things I've found, which is why I like to, you know, switch off and have time away and keep a balance, because, you know, I know people who've not just got obsessed because they're fascinated by it, but it's almost as if something is reeling them in and starts to manipulate them, and sometimes that manipulation doesn't happen in a good way. It's as if, you know, they've almost like a possession kind of thing. I've seen that happen a few times.
That's an interesting point. It's actually kind of synchronistic that you were talking about that, because I was going to segue into asking you about government disinformation, which, at least in one public example, led to very destabilizing results for somebody. Recently, that movie Mirage Men came out, which talked a lot about this whole example. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm wrong, but I could have sworn that one of the pieces of disinformation that they were feeding, or supposed disinformation, was, you know, this story about aliens manipulating human genetics in order to create humanity, essentially. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Maybe they slip in some real information along with the disinfo, but it gets hard to see clearly through those waters.
Yeah, well, you're probably talking about Paul Benowitz, are you?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's actually, Mirage Men, you know, is an interesting book, and it covers a lot of different subjects, but I don't know if you've read Greg Bishop's book on Benowitz, which is actually a full-length book. It's called Project Beta, BETA, and it's published actually back in 2005. That's like close to, I think, a 300-page book just about the whole Benowitz thing. And for people who don't know, Paul Benowitz was a scientist who had a company called Thunder Labs, which was actually positioned literally outside of the fence of Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. And I mean, when I say literally backed onto the base, I'm not joking. It was, the building was positioned outside of the Kirtland fence. And Benowitz began to notice strange things flying in and around Kirtland and Manzano, and thought, well, you know, these aren't normal aircraft. There's something strange going on. And he started to monitor their movements and came to believe they were literal UFOs. And then started to get weird messages on his computer, and he then started getting weird stuff happening in his life, people following him, watching him, seeing strange balls of light in his house, and having weird synchronicities and things like this. Well, he then started to tell everybody and his brother what was going on, and he came to believe that Kirtland was, you know, there was like a military arm, if you like, that was liaising with these extraterrestrials, and there was underground installations, you know, with crashed UFOs, dead aliens, possibly even live aliens. And it was then that, ironically and amazingly, the military came to Benowitz and essentially said, yeah, you're right, but you can't tell anybody, this is dangerous, you know, we're not completely in control of the situation. And they expanded upon this by saying there was this sort of subterranean installation in Dulce in northern New Mexico under this huge mesa called Archuleta Mesa, and they fed him all these weird and, you know, bizarre stories of different levels to the Dulce base where there were nightmarish experiments going on and captured humans, and that the U.S. government essentially wasn't allowed in there, you know, to become a no-go area even for the military, that they were, you know, nobody dared go down there for whatever was going on. And essentially this, you know, it sent Benoit's crazy with stress and fear that he tapped into something that the rest of us didn't know. There was this, this sort of malignant alien presence that the government couldn't control. And, the